democratic elections are quite magical. At the ballot box, the democratic ideal of equality is realized. Everyone is equal. Old and young, man and woman, rich and poor, everyone counts the same. The vote puts power into the hands of the people collectively without putting any excessive influence into the hands of any individual or any small group of persons. And because of this magic, we can trust the vote. Not when there is cheating, obviously, but when things run correctly. We then trust the vote in the sense that what the vote says stands. The vote, when managed correctly, has enormous authority. And it has that authority for two reasons. The first is that we have an articulated, absolutely clear theory of the democratic vote, free and fair elections. We know what it means to manage the vote correctly, and on this there is no dispute. When people sometimes speak in contempt of voting, it's not voting they are speaking in contempt of, but mess elsewhere that undermines the integrity of the vote. And second, because we know what free and fair elections are, we can invest enormously into the management of the vote. It's incredibly expensive to run democratic elections, so we invest economically. And we invest bureaucratically. It takes a huge apparatus of people and of machinery to get it to work. And those costs and those efforts we gladly accept. We have recently seen the authority of the vote in dramatic display. It was the integrity of the vote that saved American democracy from the attempted coup d'etat in January 2021. Likewise, in Brazil, the integrity of the vote made it impossible for Bolsonaro and his followers to seriously contest the result of the 2022 election. Now, that's not to suggest that we should not consider improvements in democratic voting. And I'm very sympathetic to the kind of experimentation that is organized by this institute. In fact, what I'd like to do today is to encourage you here at the Institute, to bring your competence and your imagination to making improvements in other parts of the democratic process, which I will return to shortly. So there are no doubt improvements to be made. I myself have for years been advocating a children's vote to put voting power behind the interests of children. And to do that by allowing parents to manage a proxy vote on behalf of children who are too young to vote for themselves. I think this could be done very easily and in a way that would complete the slow process towards universal suffrage. It's a matter of enormous consequence, and I'll be very glad to speak about it more afterwards. But a children's vote is a pending improvement in the system of voting. I've been advocating it, I said, for years with very little success, but I continue to do so, and I would like to bring the imaginative people at the H21 Institute onto that bandwagon. However, before we get to election day, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the process that does not have any of the magic or the authority of the vote. So let me turn to more scruffy matters. Peter referred to a book with the subtitle, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government. And I think one answer to that is that lies in, not in the vote, but in what happens long before we get to voting. So Peter, I'll make use of your slides since I don't have any of my own, so you'll excuse me for that. And these things that lie before the vote is what I would like to challenge you folks to take an interest in and to invest your imagination into. So before there are elections, there are nominations. We voters can only choose between those candidates who have managed to get themselves nominated. And I believe we should pay much more attention than we have been inclined to the process of nominations. Here we have no theory, we have no notion of free and fair nominations. And we have nothing like orderly or authoritative processes. So nominations then. There are various ways. One way, classical way in democratic systems, is for candidates to be adopted by a political party. And the thinking then is that there is competition inside the party which sees to it, which lifts forward able and honorable candidates and which block out other ones. And that may work depending on circumstances, but those circumstances are now not very favorable. Parties are increasingly irrelevant or corrupted as organizations, and generally I don't think we can trust parties to be effective nominating organizations. It was, to refer to an example from my own country, it was a party nomination that lifted Liz Truss to become Prime Minister in Britain. I don't know if you even remember her. She was Prime Minister for about a month and caused huge havoc into Britain's political and economic system. The Conservative Party in Britain has a very small membership, and a membership that is, to put it carefully, not exactly representative of the population. Another way to manage nominations is by primary elections. The competition then, so to speak, is taken out of the party setting and turned over to voters. This is the American way of doing it, and there is a thrust in many other democracies towards more use of some form of primary voting, more use of voter influence in the nomination process. That's not illogical. It would seem democratic to let citizens and voters have more say, but unfortunately, the evidence is that it is easily distorted and corrupted. One reason is what we might call the tyranny of minorities. Turnout in primary elections tends to be low, and in low turnout processes, the fanatics have the upper hand. In the American case, for example, the National Rifle Association is generally able to mobilize enough gun lobby voters in primaries that candidates cannot afford to alienate them. And that minority influence is enough to explain the peculiarity in the US Congress, in which most members perfectly understand the need for gun control, but cannot follow through on that understanding because they know who they will meet, who they will face in the next primary elections. This influence does not depend on any minority power in primary elections, just a sufficient minority power to hold the tilting vote. It is also possible to self-nominate. In Britain, for example, anyone who can stand for parliament, who is able to gather a relatively low number of signed backers, and who is willing to put down a little bit of deposit money, which he or she will forfeit if they don't obtain a reasonably number of votes. As our host today knows, this is also possible in the Czech Republic, but not without impediments. Now, in these various ways, these procedures have in common that they are designed so that candidates should be tested before they obtain nomination. That is to shut out unworthy candidates and to advance worthy ones. But if we look around, we see easily that this does not work very well. It is now a big democratic problem that terrible candidates win nomination, and perhaps, I think also, that potentially good candidates do not stand because of the turmoils of the process of getting oneself nominated. Throughout, the quality of political leadership is just awful. And that's not because there's any mistake that happens at the point of election, but because mess happens in the pre-election phase in nominations. Now, in a recent book, I'll show it to you. Had I been as well organized as Peter, I would have smuggled it into some slides, but I haven't done that, so I'll show it to you in this way, how democracies live. In this book, I have recommended a method of more stringent pre-nomination testing by way of a fit and proper person test. A pre-nomination test that those who want to stand for office are fit and proper persons. Now that is a form of vetting that is today much used in business, in sports, and in organizational life, and it is one which I recommend we import into political life. Now, my recommendation is a requirement on candidates to file with the relevant electoral authority a declaration in which they make various commitments, such as that they do not have any criminal convictions in their history, that they have not misstated or falsified biographical facts about themselves, that they have not withheld serious income or property from taxation, and that authorizes the electoral authority to check the veracity of the documentation they have provided and to provide, if relevant, that documentation. If unwilling to file, the candidate would be unable to stand. If it later emerges that the candidate has filed falsely, they would be dismissed from office. Now, this is a test that could be applied across the board, irrelevant of what kind of nominating process is used, whereby anyone who wants to stand for office must file in advance a form of commitment of this kind. Now, I recognize that this is not exactly a super imaginative idea, although I don't think you should underestimate its force. But you folks here at this institute know a lot about procedures and technology, and you might be able to apply that knowledge and that competence to introduce more robust testing procedures in the process of nomination. So that's a second challenge to friends here. In addition to the children's vote, look at procedures of nomination and get more robust across-the-board method of testing candidates into those procedures. Now, one reason why nominations easily get perverted is that private money is allowed to subvert democratic procedures. The magic of voting is that money does not count at the ballot box. It doesn't matter if you are rich or poor. You count exactly the same. But ahead of voting, money counts, and those who have it are allowed to buy themselves more influence than others. The economist Arthur Oken years ago called it transgression, on the logic that when private money transgresses from economic markets into political competition, democracy is eroded. Now, it's probably not necessary here, I think, to go on about the destructive influence of private money in politics. We all understand that. But the problem is that money is needed. It's not only elections that are expensive, but it's also expensive to run for office, to maintain political parties and political machines, and to campaign and all that business. It's very expensive, so money is needed. Somewhere, money has to come into that process. The question is where it's going to come from. While we, as a matter of obviousness, consider elections to be a public good and therefore to be paid for publicly from the public purse, we think differently of the pre-election processes, of competing for nomination and all that comes through as something different. Again, we have no theory of these matters, no agreed understanding of what this pre-election business is about, and as a result, there is no orderly finance. It's a private matter. It is left to parties and candidates to raise money as best they can. They turn to citizens, to organizations, to businesses, to individuals, often promising potential benefits and advantages in return. It is not surprising then that there will be massive corruption and the buying and selling of political influence. Now, most political systems have some regulations to prevent excesses in private corruption of political processes, but it is a very difficult matter to control. And regulations are, in today's climate, increasingly cut back. In the United States, for example, the Supreme Court has decided that it's a matter of freedom of expression to be free to use your own money politically. Now, political scientists have given a lot of thought to finding alternatives to the problem of transgression. And the main idea that has emerged in one form or another is to use a voucher system. Now, pre-voting politics is taken to be then, behind this thinking, taken to be a public good, the same way as voting, which should be funded, like elections, from public money. That could be done, it has been suggested, in the form of vouchers that are allocated to voters and which voters can then turn over to parties and candidates. The distribution of the money then lands in the hands of the voters. It's public money, but voters decide on its distribution. And I myself have been part of that lobbying. It's been going on for a long time. But the truth is that in spite of energetic activity, this idea has not at all taken on, except in small circles of policy nerds such as myself. And I have become skeptical, partly because I think it's too complicated. Vouchers distributed equally to voters would not be worth very much and not enough probably for many voters to bother about. It's complicated, it wouldn't do the job. I've therefore been exploring an alternative. Again, in this book I referred to, which I discuss under the label of a fiscal clearinghouse. Now, the attraction of the voucher system, the voucher idea, is that it puts money, power, into the hands of voters on a pretty equitable basis. Fine. I now accept the view in jurisprudence that it would be repressive to deny people the right to support candidate parties and causes with their own money. I'm not sure I do so philosophically, but I think it's a fact in jurisprudence now. But I add that this should be done under protections against dangers of monopolization. The vote is actually a perfect market. Each individual counts the same and no one has any noticeable individual power. But the funding of pre-voting politics is wide open to monopoly influences. In the same way we should protect economic markets against monopolizations, we should protect political processes with anti-monopoly regulations. So my suggestion now is to leave the whole matter of pre-election funding, funding of parties and campaigns and candidates, to voters, and to encourage all citizens to donate money to politics, to political causes. But under two protections. First, that the donor decides who gets his or her contribution, but that the recipient does not know who the donor is. Now, donors and recipients only need to know each other if the purpose is to buy political influence. If that is not the purpose, there is no reason why recipients should know who the donor is, or why a donor should have knowledge that the recipient knows that he is the donor. Second, there should be limitations upwards on how much any individual could give. That is to prevent the big donations, which are the sources of monopolies, and to preserve reasonable equity in this funding system. Then, to make this work and to get citizens to contribute, I suggest a matching contribution from the public purse, from the government, so that on top of private contributions. So if I put 10 euros into the fiscal clearinghouse for the benefit of this or that party, then another 10 euros follows from the state budget. In this way, it will be the citizen and not the government who decides the distribution of the money, the public money as well as the private money. And each voter will know that for every euro or krona or whatever he or she contributes, the recipient gets 2. It's a free 100% benefit. In my proposal, I add that a proportion of the public matching funds, say 20%, be allocated to funds in support of civil society engagement, including emerging political parties that are not yet established enough to be recipients of private donations. Such funds should ideally be managed locally as a way of encouraging local civic and political activity. Now, a merit of this proposal, I think, is its simplicity. On my smartphone, I allocate a sum of money to some recipient. It goes into the clearinghouse, which automatically channels it to the intended recipient. No bureaucracy, no trouble, no monopolies, none of the nasty business of political donations stirring up corruptive practices. Now, again, this is possibly a good idea, not very imaginative, but a workable idea. And it's another idea that I would like to encourage our imaginative and competent ladies and gentlemen of the H21 Institute to get themselves involved in. So, ladies and gentlemen, then let's first of all celebrate the magic of the vote and the authority and importance of the democratic vote. Let's sort out nominations to shut the door on corrupt, self-serving politicians and making it more meaningful for potentially good leaders to seek public office. And let's end the corruption of free-for-all private money and take the power of political funding out of the hands of the moneymen and into the hands of ordinary citizens and voters on an equitable basis comparable to the status they have in the process of voting. And let me encourage our H21 friends to engage in these matters and to put their ingenuity and imaginations to work for them. Thank you very much.
Hello, hello. Thank you very much, Professor Ringen, for that wonderful lecture and for the appeal. Just a quick note, we've already been looking into the mechanisms of nominations, so we have something to build on. And also we have our colleagues from the Foundation Against Corruption, so they may take on the other bit. So many thanks again. Now we have quite a bit of time for questions, so please raise your hand. My colleague will give you the mic.
Peter Molek, thank you for a very nice speech, and it was very interesting. I would like to ask you about one point you proposed, and that is matching of the donations to individuals or parties by the government. Looking at the demographics of, for example, our Czech parliamentary system, there are parties which are more preferred by people with lower income, and there are other parties which are preferred by people with higher income. I would like to ask you whether this wouldn't create an advantage for the higher income parties as a disadvantage for the other ones. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think that's right. Much of the problems in nomination processes that I mentioned are in the category of tyranny of the minorities. And the ability of fanatical minorities to gain political power. And we know from research, my suggestion is essentially that a lot of people should give a little bit of money. Not a few people a lot of money, but a lot of people a little bit of money each. And that's massively done now in, again, most of the experiences from America, where this sort of funding is most advanced and developed. And there is evidence that fanatics give more money than others. So there is a minority, tyranny or minority problem in this proposal also, which I think you are right to point out. My countering of that is the matching contribution from the government, which would make it profitable for individuals to give money, in the sense that the recipient would receive much more than they are giving. Now that should, I would hope, encourage more people to give political money. And also, I would really, in my suggestion, is to leave the whole matter of funding to voters. Now, we want democracy, so I'm saying, okay, if we want democracy, we'll have to pay for it. You do it, voters, pay for it. You have to do it. You want democracy, you have to contribute. Also, not just by going to the vote, but also by contributing some money. But I think there is a problem, which you point out. I don't have a solution to it, except the matching fund part of the proposal, which I think is partly to counter the problem which you have pointed out. I'm a great believer in matching contributions, actually. I think the whole tax system could be changed radically and made to depend much more on matching contributions than on just money extracted from people's pockets. But that's another discussion which we could have and you could come back to later.
Professor, thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question related to the huge power of political and media PR, which comes into play even before a person starts to be a politician. We have seen in Czech Republic many people whose campaign started 2 or 3 years before they actually went into politics, and this was paid for by the huge money of let's say oligarchs, to be short. Is there any way you could imagine to counter this huge power, which cannot be very well countered by influence of single voters, even many of them, and their contributions? Thank you.
Well, as I said, I think candidates should be obliged to file a declaration of some sort. We can discuss what that should contain. But then the question is, when should they do that? When should they do that? And obviously, it has to be at some point where they're not just running around and discussing politics, as you and I may be doing. We may have in mind that we're going to be candidates, or we may not. But so it has to be at the point when they declare themselves. So sort of electoral laws will have to decide what is the point at which a candidate is declared and will then be required to make that filing, which I suggest which I recommend they should be filing. And I don't really have an answer to that. There is probably no other way around than to say it will be at the point where the person says, I'm going to run for office. Okay. At that point, you have to file, in my idea, this declaration. But you're right to point out that there is a technical regulatory issue about when that point is met. I mean, we want people to run around and discuss politics and be obnoxious and so on. So we don't want to prevent that. But at some time, we turn from being discussants to making ourselves candidates. And at that time, we have to declare ourselves.
Expertocracy, people who are experts come into politics even before they candidate, or they are candidates, or they are never candidates.
They're never candidates, yeah. And of course, we want experts to work and to contribute. But those who are going to be candidates, stand for election, in my opinion, they should declare themselves. And there should be more requirements on that. I mean, some of this is inspired by actual examples. I mean, one example, obviously, is almost everything these days, is Donald Trump. You know, under my suggestion, he would not have been able to stand. Another curious example in the United States was this candidate called George Santos, who ran and was elected for Congress in a constituency in New York, and who had lied about everything in his Not a word of what he said about himself was true. He was a petty criminal. He produced a CV that says he was a successful businessman with lots of properties, honorable family life, and so on. Everything was a pack of lies. So under my suggestion, he also would not have been able to stand. But it's not, you know, it's not only to prevent the rascals, but it's also to encourage others. And there's it's not so visible, we can't see it, but there is, I'm absolutely sure, a big problem of people who could be absolutely excellent leaders not standing for politics. because the process is so raw and brutal and unpleasant. So there is a question not only of discouraging the bad ones, but also of encouraging the good ones. And one way of encouraging the good ones is to make it really difficult for the bad ones to stand.
Okay, any questions from this part of the audience?
Vladimir Zelinsky. Dear Mr. Professor, why didn't you mention great influence of one-sided mainstream media on election process?
Sorry,
Of one-sided or biased mainstream media on election process.
Sorry, I'm sure it reflects ignorance on my part, but I'm not sure I don't quite. Could you explain a bit better, a bit more?
I think the question is about mass media bias towards particular candidates, if that plays into the process of elections, nominations, money, and so on.
Of mass media bias. Yeah. Listen, I'm not a media basher. I don't think. In general, I don't think media bias decides very much. It may look pretty ugly at times. Actually, the press today is nothing in ugliness compared to the press a century ago. But I think listen, my answer is not good. I'm not entirely on the ball on this question, but I don't think that media bias is very much of an explanation of difficulties in current democratic politics. I think I'll just leave it at that. It's not a good answer, I'm sorry, but as far as I can take it.
Thank you. I noticed that you are speaking about a field which is an endless struggle. The attempts at reforms of political campaigning, electoral system, and so on, is incessant. And in fact, what we are looking at is not some pristine original wilderness, but in itself a result of past attempts at reform, past changes of rules reacting to deficiencies in the system. If you look at the American system as an example, for instance, there's this primaries, the huge network of so-called super PACs and stuff like that, which spending limits. The system is very complex result of previous attempts at reform. In other countries, we can see incessant. Especially some countries are prone to constant changes of electoral system, attempts at for instance, premium for the winner, which tend to be introduced in some countries after a few reasons abolished, then introduced in other countries, and so on. I'd like to ask if you can name a reform effort that has been, in fact, in your opinion, successful. And my second, just small factual question, the issue of votes for children, parents have handling a vote, proxy vote for their children. Where has been this idea closer to implementation? Is there a country?
Well, on the first question, I mean, you mentioned the United States. The United States was actually, for a very long time, very successful in regulating the use of private money in politics, specifically use of corporate money. So there was a series of very well-functioning regulations that shut out the use of corporate money for political purposes. That is, that company directors could not invest company money into politics. And that whole body of regulations went out the window in a Supreme Court decision about 10 years ago, Citizens United decision, where the regulations against the use of corporate money, 100 years of regulatory tradition, was thrown out by the Supreme Court in one decision. So that was a massive change in the degree of corruption in the American political system. That happened overnight. It had been pretty well functioning, and then it was thrown out by the Supreme Court. So it's not difficult to find, and many countries in Europe have eminent regulatory arrangements to steer to some degree the use of private money in politics. So I don't think it's difficult to find regulations. It's difficult to find regulations that will be accepted, politically accepted. And I think we political scientists, we have a job on our hand of presenting ideas that might be taken up as good ideas. We worked for a long time on the voucher idea, which we thought, many of us thought, might be an idea that was attractive enough to get some traction, because it sort of mirrored the merits of voting into the process of funding. But the truth is that that idea outside our own little circle went nowhere. It had no takers as an idea. And what I have hoped now is that this fiscal clearinghouse idea might be an idea that would get some traction. I'm of course not very optimistic about that, but it is a good idea. And I think my job is to try to produce ideas, and then we'll have to see later if those ideas could have traction. I don't think the problem is technical in any way. It's a problem of getting things accepted. And one prerequisite of that is to have ideas that take on, that capture people's imaginations. And that's what many of us are struggling with, not very successfully. And that includes also the children vote. It's a brilliant idea. But it's not exactly an idea that people around the democracies are flocking up behind and advocating. It's a matter of huge consequence. But I have been touting it in book after book, and continue to do so, with relatively little success. But we do not give up. We do not give up.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and the lady over here was, sorry.
Good day. I would like to ask you, what's your position on gerrymandering, and how do you see its effects on the electoral college and on the elections? Thank you.
Right, it's a problem in many countries because boundaries have to be redrawn as demographics change. So the question, who's going to do it? And there's a simple solution to that, and it is that to take it out of the hands of elected politicians and put it into the hands of expert commissions. Again, we often refer to the United States. That's done in about half of the states, or a bit more than half of the states in the US, where political gerrymandering then has been eliminated as a problem. But it is preserved in a number of states because the elected politicians in those states want to have the power to mess around. But here there is a very simple solution. It's tried, it's implemented in many places. It's to take the drawing of electoral borders out of the hands of elected politicians and put into the hands of technical commissions.
Okay, so once again, thank you to Professor Ringen. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we will, if you have any questions, I would encourage you to seek him out in the breaks. And many thanks for the wonderful presentation.